We've now arrived in Unit 3 where we start to discuss percents. And I guess we should start with the relationship between percents, decimals, and fractions, because really percents are just another way of writing whole numbers. Generally, percents are going to be used for numbers between 0 and 1, but you can also write larger numbers in terms of percents also. So what does percent mean? It means out of 100. So essentially, if you want to say that some value is out of 100, you just use this percent symbol. So if you see 58%, that means 58 out of 100. If you see 8%, that means 8 out of every 100, right? So 8 out of every 100 basketball players are female would would correspond to 8% of professional basketball players are female. So percents are used everywhere in real life, so you'll need to understand them well. Here are three ways to rewrite the same thing. So I can write 15%, 15 100ths, or 0.15. And that, in a nutshell, is the relationship between percent, decimal, and fraction. Now, of course, you might look at that fraction and say, well, that fraction can be reduced. Sure, right? 15 hundredths, 5 will go into both of those. So 15 hundredths would really simplify to 3 twentieths. Okay, because 5 goes into 15 three times, 5 goes into 120 times. All right, so let's talk about how we would convert between percent, decimal, and fraction. So the first one is if we're converting from percent to decimal. So that's an easy one, right? Percent to decimal conversions, essentially you're really just moving the decimal point two places to the left. Okay, so 27%, I mean, if you think of 27% as meaning 27 out of 100, 27 hundredths, how would you write 27 hundredths as a decimal? Well, 27 hundredths as a decimal would just be 0.27. But what does that amount to doing? It amounts to taking the decimal point that you can consider being here after the 7 and moving it two spaces to the left. And then the same thing with 104%, right? 104%, here's the decimal point. If I move it two spaces to the left, I arrive at 1.04. So that would be 1.04. And then if I take 0.5%, the rule still applies. Right now the decimal point is here, so I got to move it two spaces to the left. So it goes there, and I have 0.005. So it's 0.005. So that would be 0.5%. So to convert from percent to decimal, you just move the decimal point two places to the left. Now when you're going from percent to fraction, I guess the easiest way to do it is realize that percent means out of 100. So 40% would mean 40 hundredths, and then you try to reduce it, right? So 20 will go into both of those. So 20 will go into 40 twice, and 20 will go into 100 5 times, right? Because remember when we did fractions, we're thinking of this as dividing by 20 and dividing by 20 because that was your GCF. So similarly, 104% would be 104 over 100. And then 4 will go into both of those. So if we divide the top and the bottom by 4, we end up with 26 25ths. All right. And then 225%, similarly, it's 225 over 100. And 25 at least will go into both of those, right? So 25 will go into 225. You think in terms of quarters. How many quarters in $2.25? 9 quarters. And how many quarters in a dollar? 4 quarters. So 225% is 9 quarters. So that's a way to do it by hand. And of course, most conversions are going to be simple like that, but some are going to require a little bit of extra care, like we had seen before the 0.5%. If we think of 0.5% similarly as 0.5 over 100, okay, I wrote it as a fraction. The problem is 0.5 is not a whole number. When you say writing something as a fraction, you really mean the numerator and denominator are going to be whole numbers, so you really have to turn the 0.5 into a whole number. So how do you do that? You basically move the decimal over 1, which amounts to multiplying by 10. So then if I did that in the numerator, I have to do the same thing in the denominator. So I would turn 100 into 1,000. So 0.5%, which is 0.5 over 100, really becomes 5 thousandths. And then I can simplify the fraction by dividing by the GCF, right? So 5 divided by 5 is 1. 1,000 divided by 5 is 200. So 0.5% is actually 1/200th. And then similarly here, 0.0625% would be 0.0625 over 100. Now this one I got to move a bunch of spaces, right? So this one I had to move 1, 2, 3, 4 places to the right. So then I got to move this one 1, 2, 3, 4 places to the right. So I would end up with 625 over 100 with 1, 2, 3, 4 extra zeros. So that's actually a million. So this is actually 625 over a million. And then you try to just reduce this as best you can. So I know 25 will go into both of these, right? 25 will go into 625 25 times, and then 25 will go into a million 40,000 times. Now it's 25 over 40,000, and then I would divide again by 25. 25 will go into both of them again. So 25 goes into 25 once, and 25 goes into 40,000 now 1,600 times. So it's 1/1600th. So those are the basic ones. Now the only time this gets a little tricky is when you have percents that are going to end up involving repeating decimals. So like 33 and a third percent is 33.333 repeating percent, right? So what you want to do with ones like this is you want to think of this again, same way we did before, 33 and a third over 100. But then we do our keep change flip. Remember when we did dividing fractions, we thought of it as multiplication by the reciprocal. So we think of 33 and a third as 100 thirds, but then times, flip 100 and you get 1/100th. And then what happens here? The 100s will cancel and you just end up with 1/3. So 33 and a third percent is actually 1/3. And then we could do a similar thing with the other ones. 8 and 3/7 percent, it's going to be 8 and 3/7 over 100. So then this is 59/7 times 1/100th. The difference here, this isn't going to reduce at all, right? There's nothing going to simplify. 59 won't go into 100 at all. So this is just going to be 59 over 700. So there's nothing nice that happens with that one. That's just 59/700ths, right? You just do your brute force multiplication. And then last one, 16 and a sixth over 100. So 16 and 1/6, it's going to be, that's 96 plus 1, so it's 97/6 times 1/100th. And again, similarly, nothing's going to happen here. This is just going to be 97/600ths. So yeah. So you think of it as doing keep change flip, and then you multiply your fractions. Moving on to decimal to percent conversions, we just do the opposite of what we did when we converted from percents to decimals. There we moved the decimal point 2 to the left, so now we're just going to move the decimal point 2 to the right. So 0.23 becomes 23%. And again, the reason this works is because 0.23 really means 23 hundredths, but we know that percent means out of 100. So 23/100ths is just equivalent to 23%, right? So that's kind of the reason why it works. You're thinking of that as being 23 hundredths. But we can just use this move the decimal over rule, right? So 2.34 is going to become 234%. And then 0.0097 is going to be 0.97%. So that's almost 1%. It's just a little bit shy of 1%, 0.97%. And then when we go fraction to percent, what can we do here? Well, probably the easiest way to do this, honestly, is first just turn it into a decimal, right? So like 3/4, you know, is 0.75. So now that we have it as a decimal, then we can use our rule for converting decimal to percent and move the decimal point over 2. This is probably the most straightforward way to do it. So 0.75 then becomes 75%. 3 over 2 is 1.5. And then if I use my rule, that becomes 150%. And then 5/8, 5/8 is 0.625. So if I move the decimal over 2 here, I have 62.5%. So that's the most straightforward way to do that. The only time that it's going to get a little bit weird is if you have something like 7/18, right? Because 7/18, if you did the division on it, it becomes 0.38 repeating, which is, you could round it to 0.389 and say it's approximately 38.9%. But the problem with that is it's not exact. So if you were going to do it more formally, what you'd have to do is think about the long division. So like here, I would get this um, 0.38, and then I'd have a remainder of 16. And if we remember, that 16 really meant 16/18, right? It was always the remainder over the thing you divided by. So it's 0.38 and 16/18. But 16/18 is really 8/9. So what you can think of this is, think of this 7 divided by 18 as 0.38 and 8/9. So what is 0.38 and 8/9? If you then move the decimal point over 2 to turn it into a percent, it becomes 38 and 8/9%. That's a little tricky. I don't really expect you to be able to do that well at this point, but if you can see that, it's actually somewhat useful. And then I have this thing that I call my nerd table, which gives you all the common fractions, decimals, and percents equivalences. So this is a nice thing to know, right? And these are ones that I would consider like mental math that you probably should know. So like a half as a decimal, of course, we know that's 0.5, and we know that's 50%. That's a given. I mean, yeah, at minimum, you have to know that. But then 0.3 repeating is actually the fraction 1/3, which is actually, as a percent, 33 and a third percent. That was one of the ones we saw earlier. And then 66 and 2/3 percent is just double that. So it would be 0.6 repeating as a decimal, or 2/3. 0.25, most people know, right? Most people know that that's a quarter, and you know that that's 25%. And then 3/4, you know that that's 0.75 or 75%. And then the next few I give you are the fifths, right? So 0.2 is actually 1/5. These ones are like a little bit less well known, and then that becomes 20%. And then 40% is double that, so it's 0.4, which is 2/5. And then 0.6 is going to be 60%, or 3/5. And then 4/5 is going to be 0.8, or 80%. And then I get into some wackier ones, which I'm not even going to really get into here. But one of the key things to remember also with this that I didn't even mention before, and I definitely should have, is that 1 is equal to 100%, right? So any percent that's over 100 is going to be over 1. So if you see something like, 110%, that's really greater than 1. So anything over 100% is greater than 1. And then anything over 200% is greater than 2, and so on. Okay, so in terms of this table, a lot of these ones are kind of wacky, which I don't expect you to know. The other ones, though, that you should definitely know probably are like 1/10, right? 1/10 is 0.1, which is 10%, because that comes in handy in a lot of cases. And then 0.3 is 3/10, so that's 30%. And then 70% is 0.7, or 7/10. And then 9/10 is 0.9, or 90%. The reason I didn't do this whole table is because I went a little overboard with this table. That's why I call it my nerd table. It has some, fractions, decimals, and percents that generally normal people don't really care about. So I'll just stop there, right? So we did the halves, the thirds, the fourths, the fifths, and the tenths. All right. So hopefully you can at least know the halves and the quarters and the tenths. Those are probably the most important ones to remember.